Hello, everyone, and welcome once again to Nashville Forward, a brand new podcast presentation by Cumulus Media. My name is Matt Murphy, and we are emanating from the beautiful performance studio here on Music Row at Cumulus Nashville. We're proud to have you with us for another episode of Nashville Forward. It's an opportunity for us to have a conversation with a business leader in the city of Nashville, the state of Tennessee, and our region of the world. And these are business leaders that impact Middle Tennessee, impact the Southeast, the nation, and by extension, the entire globe. Their business headquarters oftentimes are here, or they have a major hub of headquartering here in Nashville, Tennessee, and our next guest is no exception. We'll learn more about these companies, their leadership. We'll share their vision of their business future with you, the audience, as well as how that future coincides with the future of Nashville and, by extension, the state. It is a pleasure to welcome our next guest to the program. His name is David Briggs. We're going to call him Dave, and he is the regional president of Fifth Third Bank, and it is wonderful to have you in the performance studio. Dave, welcome
Matt,
in.
Appreciate it. Thanks for being here.
It's a pleasure. Well, before we talk about Fifth Third, I want to get to know a little bit about you and your background. Just tell us a little about yourself. Where did you grow up?
Yeah, I'll give you the thumbnail sketch story. My father had his career with IBM, which back in the day used to also sound for I've been moved. So was born in the Midwest, spent 3 years in Paris. My mom happened to be a Brit with a fair amount of family over there. Afforded me a great opportunity at a young age to get to know that side of the family. We then moved back to the New York City area, and I had my middle school and high school years in New Canaan, Connecticut. The one common destination throughout childhood were my grandparents on my father's side in Asheville, North Carolina. Love that part of the country. And that, with a confluence of other items, wound up going to Western Carolina University. Started in banking right out of school, thinking I needed a job, and it was a good place to start. And I thought I would probably then leverage and go work in industry. 35 years later, I'm still in banking. I started with what was a predecessor bank to Bank of America, moved 6 times in 10 years across North Carolina before coming to Nashville in 2000. After 27 years with Bank of America, I decided to follow an executive that had started banks and left to join Capital Bank, where I grew our Tennessee operations. And then a year later, we sold the bank to First Horizon. Stayed on with them for a year to help with their strategy and lead their commercial bank. And then after that, the dust had settled and we parted ways. I like to tell people I had a lot of fun playing with all my various hobbies, racing bikes, water skiing, traveling, until my wife sat me down and made it abundantly clear one of us was going back to work, and made it even more clear it was going to be me. So welcome Fifth Third some 6 years ago, where I came on to lead the commercial bank for Tennessee. And then during the pandemic, was asked to move into the president's role.
Sure. All right, a lot to unpack there. I want to start here, though. Of all the places that you moved when you were younger, when your father was moving you around with IBM, what was your favorite? Was it Nashville? Or
it's a great question. How can you not like Paris? Although as a kid...
This is not Paris, Tennessee.
This is not Paris, Tennessee,
right,
although I love Paris, Tennessee, for the record.
Sure.
And we had more people visit us as a family in that 3 years than we did cumulatively the rest of my parents' lives. And although as a kid I did not like being drugged to the Versailles and the Louvre, but going up to Normandy and seeing the World War II history was amazing. And then I've got to say...
How old were you?
It was 8, 9, and 10.
Did you take it for granted at the time?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I was in American school, but we're indoctrinated into the French culture.
Did you learn French?
Sure did. And now I'm hard-pressed to speak it, still can pick up listening.
Right.
This is kind of a cool little interesting factoid of the Parisian schools. So they pack up for an entire month, Matt, and they go down to the Alps with their teachers, have a half day of school, and they ski every afternoon to learn how to ski. So the American school of Paris tried to adapt similar to that culture, but Americanize it. So we would go for a week down with all your classmates, but no school, and you ski the whole time and learn. So I learned how to ski in the French Alps, which was just amazing. And you think about taking it for granted. We'd hate these days when all this stuff called powder came, because we couldn't go bombing down as fast as we want. So turn back time, would love to repeat some of those days.
You're the topper in the room, right? When people are talking about Vail or Aspen, and where they learn to ski, and you can give them the Swiss Alps as a little bit of a topper there.
It was very privileged.
That's nice.
And again, to your comment earlier, something you absolutely took for granted.
Now, Dave, you and I just had the opportunity to meet. Just know about me, I'm just a naturally curious person. So sometimes I ask these questions just out of a sense of natural curiosity. In my regular line of work, sometimes I feel like we bag on the French. As Americans, do we do that? Do we give the French too much of a hard time?
Boy, that's a tough question, and of course one that has a huge stereotypical.
I mean,
element.
right? I mean, I think we over stereotype.
I think what was very interesting is my father. Of course, IBM had a lot of expats that came into Europe, and Dad had been effectively forewarned. And again, Dad grew up in Nashville, so a very southern, open, think of Mayberry-esque, so very open and neighborly, that, hey, you will not get to know your neighbors. They will be anti-American, again, which is bizarre. How many times has America bailed out Europe in general? So it's a little bit of a bizarre element, but we found absolutely the contrary. My parents were invited into neighbors' homes. They developed relationships. When they moved back to the States, neighbors came to visit them. And for the remaining lives of my parents, they stayed in close contact. So we found it very differently. I did take my wife back there 5 or 6 years ago, and we did all the tourist elements, but then we did spend a day and we went and found the house that we lived in. And in typical Paris, the hedges have grown and there's walls. And so we kind of peered up on the wall to look over. And the guy that owns it was going, what is going on here?
Who are these folks, right?
And so he was not the least bit friendly. And I guess understanding if you've got strange people peer their head over the hedgerow.
Right. Well, it's just it's fascinating the experience of being able to get that just flood of life at such an early age of different cultures and different cultural experiences and the way that they grow up so differently. And
it really is. And I'll fast forward. We're privileged. Probably the most important thing of my life is have twins that are will be 26 in December, a boy and a girl. There were one when we moved here. And honestly, with my backdrop, and my wife was also grew up in a corporate family and moved a lot, I struggled at the time a little bit of, all right, should we be showing our children more? Should we be moving different places to subject them to different elements? And where there's certainly a positive on that, I kept coming back. This is a hard place to be, living, working, playing, raising kids. And so what we opted to do is, all right, let's supplement that by traveling a fair amount for vacations and showing them other cultures, other areas, and trying to show it in that regards.
You mentioned your kids. I was curious as I was doing a little bit of reading before our interview. Kyle is the boy, and your daughter is Katie. Your daughter went to UT. Your son went to
Roll Tide. Yeah.
How does that work on game day?
Well, the 4 years they were there wasn't much of a rivalry. And now, interestingly enough, to further that, our son now works in Knoxville. So he has all that, and he works.
He's still a Tide fan?
Through and
Crimson
through. Matter of fact, this past weekend, he was up in Wisconsin for the game with a good excuse to have a reunion with a lot of his fraternity brothers and catch up. Of note, he loves Knoxville. He works for Axle Logistics, which is a huge UT alumni and base. So he is interviewing with them. And it was his senior year when the Tide was playing in Knoxville. And it was, again, when the Tide was just rip-roaring. That would have been the 2020 football season. So he goes up there on the Friday before the game. He's peppering me with all kinds of questions of what do I ask in an interview? What don't I ask? How do I act? And I came this close, Matt, of just saying, dude, well, I said, first off, dress up. You have one chance to make a first impression.
Sure.
Secondly, I came this close to saying, don't wear your damn Bama tie. but he did.
Did he?
Well, the guys would just say, dude, really? And of course they loved it. And then you fast forward 2 years later.
I'll say, I don't mean to interrupt your train of thought. You've got to be confident if you're taking care of your business and you're Bama tie in Knoxville.
That's right.
Right.
So 2 years later, the schedule comes out, and of course nobody wants a suite for the Bama game because they're just assuming they're going to get Knoxville's UT is going to get crushed. So Kyle invites a bunch of his clients. Well, then as the season pans out, as we well recall, UT's having a great year, so it's setting up for this great matchup. So among others, the owners toggle and invoke, hey, we're going to be in the suite as well. And as we all recall, great victory from UT. So they had a field day with Kyle on that. And again, Kyle was absolutely fine with it. They won fair and square, well deserved. But
good for you. It has to make Saturdays watching games fun with the rivalries that go on amongst
and particularly as we go now,
son and daughter.
Both teams playing exceptionally well.
Wow.
The college football environment is a whole different paradigm altogether now, so it's going to be very interesting in a lot of fun. Weeks.
And it really, and I don't know, you know, I've had an opportunity to travel a little bit around the United States and a little bit overseas, but the Southeast has that, and I don't think we recognize often enough what a familial relationship the Southeastern Conference and college football in and of itself is.
And the impact financially.
Oh, no question.
I had been to Tuscaloosa. Ironically enough, my roommate in college had a very close friend of his in high school, went to Alabama. So eons ago, we road tripped from Western Carolina to Tuscaloosa, and we had a great time. But it was a fraction of what it is now. So when we walked campus with Kyle, it's amazing. And I tell folks, if you don't think that having a perpetual, perennial, top-ranked team has an impact, walk around Tuscaloosa for 30 minutes.
No question.
Everything is done absolutely to the nines. And then every SEC campus has that element. It's really amazing.
You know, living in, I was in Birmingham for 20 years, and I grew up in Georgia, so I'm a Georgia Bulldog. And we win a national championship the year that I moved to Nashville. And I tell all my friends in Birmingham, if I'd have known this, I'd have left Alabama 20 years ago. But it truly is the case that, I oftentimes on my radio show in Birmingham said, forget the governor, forget, United States senators. Nick Saban is the most important man in the state of Alabama right now, and most people, if they think about it, would agree because of the economic
without a doubt
impact. That level of success can bring you.
And I think you could still argue that today, even though he's a step removed.
I've said this, not to draw you to politics. I've said this, as red as Alabama is, there's one person that I believe could run for governor as a Democrat and win. And that man is Nick Saban, if he decided to run as a Democrat.
I think you're absolutely right. And it was interesting. We went down for the LSU game. I believe that was Kyle's senior year, but that's irrelevant. But when Trump came...
Sure. Were you there that game? Oh, yeah.
And we're going, you talk about a target-rich environment where when you have Louisiana and Alabama, 99.7% of your constituents there.
Sure. And he's apparently Bama plays Georgia, and the plan is for Trump to make an appearance at that game.
Oh, interesting.
In a couple of Saturdays. So,
I had heard that.
He understands where his people are and where they live and breathe. So let me. I'm very curious about this. As a fat boy who likes my fried food and enjoys golf on occasion, I am fascinated with your interest, your passion in cycling. Are you a glutton for punishment, Dave?
I think there is a little bit of element of that, Matt. I grew up with an absolute passion playing high school football. One of the reasons I went to Western Carolina was I really wanted to stretch myself. I knew I couldn't play full-fledged Division I football, but many of my high school teammates were going to small liberal arts schools in New England. Great schools, great elements, but Division III football, and I wanted to stretch myself. My football career never took off the way I had planned. But I enjoyed the working outside, so I actually took that to a level. I've always enjoyed competing and trying to challenge myself, so I actually did a couple bodybuilding shows in college and immediately following. And then that's a 24/7, 365 element. The diet is just crazy. So it's hard to have a business environment where you're going out and trying to entertain and connect with folks, and you can't eat anything at lunch or dinners, and you're having to train all the time. So I just, and I always fought putting on weight until I was 35, and then I was putting on all the weight and then some. Hated running, had no interest in aerobics, but I started doing these spin classes, and I just fell in love with it. And I had a boss who had said, "Hey, what's going on? You're losing weight. Things are looking good." I told him, and he said, "You ever thought about riding outside?" I said, "Well, yeah, but I've checked into it, and just to get started, it's a couple $1,000." And the next day he came, he said, "I've been thinking about what you told me." He says, "What if I ship you one of my triathlon bikes?" So he, out of just his own desire to have somebody else join the sport, sent me his bike. That's how I got started. One of our clients was had moved from New York to join the family business, was into racing, and I started riding with him. I raced less than a year after starting, and I got hooked on the competitive nature of it. And so I've just finished my 21st year of racing bikes. It's been fun. And the older I get, the faster everyone else seems to get, Matt. And then I've been water skiing and barefoot skiing since high school years. We have a place at Smith Lake in Alabama, so I still spend 3 weekends a month barefooting,
maybe the most
skiing.
Beautiful lake in the United States.
I would not argue with you there. It's incredible.
Gorgeous.
Yeah,
and a great place to water ski. Now, help me understand how one goes about barefoot skiing.
It's one of these things that there is kind of a cool feel and look to it. There's nothing, and particularly, I'm not advanced at all. I do what's called a tumble turn, where I drop down, I spin around, and plant your feet and get up. And there's just something about sliding across the water on your backside and then on your feet that's just kind of a cool experience. It's really fun when you fall as well, because it go down very quickly, very, very hard. But and it's much easier to do than what it looks. But, man, it's interesting how just society changes. When I was in high school, we had to get up before dawn to find good water, because everybody water skied and you fought for getting smooth water. Now we rarely see anybody even wakeboarding, much less you never see anybody water skiing. And once every few years you see somebody barefooting. And everybody's doing surfing and tubing, including ourselves. We have one of those as well. We're guilty as charged. But there's just something, and I've even read about it psychologically, from a slalom skiing or even a snow skiing, the pivoting back and forth just has a psychological pleasing sensation to it. And
why do you think we're seeing less of it? Are we just indoors more nowadays, or?
I think surfing is so easy, and you're going at 11 miles an hour. You fall, you sink into the water. You're not ripping across the wake at 70 miles an hour. Now, I will say this, Matt, the people that do water ski are unbelievable. Their shoulders are a foot off the wake coming across. The results they have of short rope going around the course is unbelievable. Like so many other things, the technology advances in equipment has been helpful, their training. So even though it's a diminished group, the folks that still do it are unreal.
Does that competitive nature of yours, I would expect that it translates into the business world?
Oh, absolutely. And then, even drawn back to the cycling front, I probably have had more client recruiting business connections from cycling than anything else. And the same things that make people successful cycling, preparation, discipline, training. And the best thing about training is an environment where if you do it right, you want to push to where you fail. But it's a fail-safe area. You don't want to fail in business. But all those characteristics set up to be very successful in the business world.
I'll mangle it, but Mario Andretti had a quote about auto racing, that if you don't find yourself slipping over the edge on occasion, then you're not getting close enough to it. Does the same translate into the world of cycling? But I would think that's more of a physical edge rather than the edge of the automobile's capability.
There's a little of both. Certainly pushing yourself to how far you can. I guess the analogy back to motorsports, Matt, would be how far can you press the tack before you blow the motor, and getting as much horsepower as you possibly can, and you don't know until you fail it. So that's helpful in just growing your internal motor, your physical body motor. But then there's also an element of, all right, do you stick your nose in this gap to go? And you have to have an edge of being aggressive. And you'll learn from your failures. Here's another corollary to business. People will often ask me, will you wrecked? And my stock answer is not this week, or not yet this week.
Right.
It happens, and nobody sets out to have it occur, but you learn from it. But on the flip side, so I recall great race series that I did for better part of a decade up in St. Louis over Labor Day called Gateway Cup. So up there having a really great night on a Friday. Thought last lap, last corner, I've got a lead. A guy comes across me, cuts in front of my wheel, takes me out, and I just go tumbling down. So you walk away going, all right, watch for the guy coming over on your wheel. So you remember that in future races, but if that's all you're thinking of, you'll never advance. Right. So you still have to have that number one focus of how am I looking to win, but also learning, all right, wait a minute, if I get across and here someone comes over, maybe I ought to edge over because he may come over quicker and take out my wheel.
I'm inspired to tell the story. It has nothing to do with Fifth Third Bank, but it's one of my favorite sports memories, just watching sporting activities. And it's been tainted to a certain degree because of what came out later. But Lance Armstrong at the Tour de France, there was a stage in the Tour de France where I think the incline was somewhere in the neighborhood of 45 degrees. I mean, it's just an insane incline. And you probably can just cite chapter and verse when this happened. But I remember I happened to be watching it. And Armstrong looked beat. I mean, he looked beat down. He looked tired. He looked roughed up. He looked just like he was laboring. And there was a moment where these bicycles around him, he kind of looks, and you can see him looking at the people around him, seeing where they were mentally and physically, and then he just kicked it into another gear and just left them.
And it's called the look, actually. And it was Jan Ullrich, who was his chief competitor. And you're right, they were all suffering. And when he had the look, he could tell they were suffering more than him.
And let's go.
Let's
press this. Let's see how bad they want. And it's that combination of physical ability and mental ability to overcome adversity that's pretty fascinating.
It's interesting, too, just a little bit of a sidebar there, Matt. The cycling community is it's kind of a bizarre sport, right? It's not your prototypical American, people aren't born going, I hope my kid's a cyclist. It just kind of happens. But it's a close-knit environment. So I've had numerous rides with Lance. He spent a fair amount of time here in Tennessee. Matter of fact, one of my favorite pictures is we were on a ride and one of my teammates behind me takes a shot, and Lance and I are looking at each other, chatting on the bike as we're riding through Leaper's Fork. And at one point in that ride, he put his hand on me, which is kind of a common thing to look back so you don't lose perception of where you are next to other bike. And it was just whoa, wait a minute. I've got the 7-time Tour de France champion with his hand on my back. And it was just like, don't wreck him.
Right.
But
it's just kind of a life check moment too, right? Like,
just what sport do you have that ability to be that close to certainly at the time, and very debatable and arguable for a variety of factors, but certainly some would say the GOAT, right?
No question.
Yeah.
I still think he's the GOAT of autobiographical titles too. It's not about the bike, which is just, it's such a great testimony to those that want to overcome, achieve, and win, how they are willing to
without a doubt. Yeah.
The mental and physical preparations. Let's talk a little more about business. Let's talk about Fifth Third. What is I think I know the answer to this question before I ask it, but I'm going to ask it anyway. What is the question that you get more often than anything about Fifth Third Bank?
Where'd the name come from?
Of course you do. Well, let's do that. Where did the name come from?
So we date back to the 1800s, and like so many others, and banks were very fragmented, and then a lot of consolidation occurred. So in the 20s, the Third National and Fifth National Banks of Cincinnati merged. And it was during Prohibition, so they didn't want to call it 3/5 because it would connotate 3/5 of liquor and whatnot. So went with Fifth Third. And it drives our math guys crazy because it's an imperfect fraction. So some of our colleagues, we have a lot of fun with just that dynamic. And as you might expect over the years, the company has studied, hey, let's do some research. Should we change the name? And invariably it's, it's different, but you know what? People remember it and it works. To me, the best part is it is the easiest email domain I've ever had. David.Briggs@53.com. Done. So going back to the bankofamerica.com or all these elements, this was very finite and simple.
Well, I mean, it certainly gets noticed, and it is nothing like you see in any other banking community, right? The name in and of itself.
Well, and we do have some privileges or self-indulged privileges that we take for it. We claim May 3rd is our day.
Sure.
And we rally around that for a lot of community involvement, and really two main throngs. One, we're all about Fifth Third babies, and we will sponsor a city each year where kids born on May 3rd are given a scholarship to prepare for college down the road. And when it's a cycle where the babies are not in your city, it's all about hunger. So we always, this last element, we had probably 150 people at Second Harvest Food Bank working for food insecurity. So we take full advantage of being able to have that name to utilize it in that regard.
You mentioned Cincinnati, so obviously, are you still the national headquarters in Cincinnati?
It is. We're the 10th largest bank, headquartered out of Cincinnati. If you look at the origins, again, not surprisingly, as inter and intrastate banking started taking hold, Fifth Third started moving and acquiring and merging with banks within Ohio. And then you went to the surrounding states around that, so very much a Midwest-centric arena. And then this certainly wasn't rocket science, but you follow population. Banks tend to do well when you have population growth, and when our communities prosper, the bank tends to prosper. So our southeastern expansion strategy has been really the last couple of decades. So the Carolinas, Georgia, Florida, and Tennessee. And then we also have teams in Texas and in California.
And what, 40 or so branches in the state?
41 in the state. We, over the next 2 years, will be injecting $150 to $180 million of capital investment here to grow more of our franchise in Knoxville, Clarksville, and continue to build out Middle Tennessee.
So as we sit in our studios, our performance studio, just off of Music Row on the day that we record this, earlier today, I was talking about it on my radio show, the Federal Reserve cut interest rate by 0.5 point. And just help the layman understand what that means, what that is, what the relationship between a company like Fifth Third is to the Federal Reserve, and what that means for the consumer of Fifth Third Bank.
Yeah, absolutely. Those of us that have been around for a minute, we were talking earlier about just kind of my background and journey. I remember when my parents were moving back to the States in the late 70s, mortgage rates were 14, 15%. And so this environment that we've been in for the last better part of a decade of mortgage rates being 2-3% is not normal. And then obviously with all the stimulus dollars that came and inflation, in quite simplistic terms, that's too much money chasing too few goods. So if everybody's trying to pay for the same banana, and you've only got one banana, you raise the price to where the highest bidder wins it. So obviously raising rates were an attempt to just contract some of that inflationary
kind of cool off the economy,
cool things off. But there's a lot of folks that just thought it was too much too soon and that we've stifled some of the economic growth. And so this easing was well planned. Before I came over, I actually checked with my mortgage teammate going, all right, I know there was some debate on, is it going to be a quarter point or a half? And when it went a half, did we see mortgage rates move today? And we haven't. So the market already had much of this built in. Mm-hmm. Now, the two implications for most consumers, Matt, is number one, anyone that's carrying credit card debt is always a percentage off of prime or very typically, so that will come down. So that's good news if you happen to carry a balance on your credit card, which, by the way, I wouldn't suggest, but just anecdotally. But then on the other side of the ledger, we finally all have been, as consumers, used to getting paid a little something for checking accounts where, for the last decade, if it's 0.2, 0.3, it's negligible, right. But we've actually been able to make some decent elements. We will see that start to come down proportionally. So banks quite simply make a spread on what you charge for a loan and what you pay on deposits. So if loans are coming down because of the market, then your deposit rates are going to go down in a proportional element as well.
So some are suggesting, and I'm very curious what you look at your relationship with the government as. Some are suggesting that relationship is too tight, too close. And I'm not suggesting anything under the table. I've heard that maybe the banking industry is too closely tied with the federal government in terms of monetary policy and how they adjust. I mean, do you understand the nature of what I'm saying? And how do you respond to that if you ever get this question?
It's a very complex web. And obviously banks are highly regulated, always have been.
Well, and by the way, and I want to not interrupt you, that comes from the government. The government is putting those regulations on the bank. I'm not suggesting that the bank necessarily wants that relationship in the manner that it is, but
yeah,
right.
But some of that is necessary to protect the general public and have an element. And then we can always debate how much is there. I think the complexity is you have different areas of the government doing different things that aren't necessarily on the same page. So, for instance, you have the Fed that has been tightening up until this point. But then on the flip side, you've got the regulators that are telling you that one side of the government wants you to open your balance sheet more and provide capital and catalysts for growth. But then the bank regulators are coming in and saying, no, you need to hold more capital. So they're fighting forces. They're contradictory.
Can I ask you if there was a moment in time? Was 2008 an example of a moment in time where what you're talking about was illustrated in the real world? In other words, it felt like the banks were being encouraged to loosen their lending practices to provide the availability for housing for more people. But at the same time, I don't know. But did that lead to some of the issues that precipitated 2008?
Well, boy, there's a lot to unpack there, Matt. The Great Recession is unlike anything we'd ever seen before,
right.
And I can't have another one. I barely. Just the stress and toil that you
Dave,
went through.
Did you have hair before?
I had hair when that was going on. So. And as people always tell me, I've got a face for radio. But there was a lot of pulling of hair, gnashing of teeth. And I remember an executive just telling me, can't we just have a good old-fashioned recession? Because you can figure that out. But if you really go back to me, I'm a simpleton, Matt. And I recall when we would have commercial clients that have oftentimes very complex tax returns. They're entrepreneurs, so there's a lot of complexities coming to their personal tax returns. So having somebody actually qualify for a traditional mortgage can be difficult. So I can recall when my mortgage teammate came to me as a commercial banker and said, hey, we've got a new product, 50% loan to value and a perfect credit score. We don't have to check income verification. It's like, hallelujah. We've got a bunch of clients that now would love to have mortgage debt that can't. Well, what transpired is you had a flood of investors that liked that kind of paper, mortgage paper. And what wasn't to like about it? Perfect credit score, 50% loan to value on a house. If something went entirely wrong, that's a pretty good bet of getting your money back. So more capital looked for a home. So banks were complicit of saying, all right, well, wait a minute. If 50% loan to value and perfect credit score worked, what if we did 60% loan to value and a little less than perfect credit score? And guess what? There was plenty of demand from investors fueling the capital on that. So this snowball kept rolling to where we'll recall, virtually if you had a pulse, you qualify for a mortgage. Mm-hmm. So look, make no doubt about it. Banks were complicit in that, but so were borrowers. I mean, look, you got to know there's no such thing as a free lunch. So right. A prudent borrower should know that's not healthy, but certainly we're investors. So when this thing all unwound, now I'm biased, I'm a banker, but I thought the penalty for banks was far too stringent compared to those of the investor community.
Right.
Like, don't tell me they didn't know what was going on. Yeah, right. Sophisticated folks. So, but look, the banking system is so much healthier because of this and the amount of capital that we hold. The other thing, fraud in this, was we talk about the mortgage side, but lest we forget, commercial real estate was hammered in this as well. So Fifth Third predates me, but went through a very concerted effort that we called our North Star plan. And a good part of that was, you know what? We are going to have a much smaller percentage of exposure to commercial real estate going forward. Because we all know it's not a matter of if there's a next recession, it's when's the next recession. So as a result, whether we've had a recession or not, that's also interesting, Matt. The folks that pontificate and fully articulate if we're in a recession or not, they're looking back in hindsight on that front. Right. And there's some scientific, but there's a lot of arbitrary. So whether we have been or not, we entered it as one of the lowest percentage of capital in commercial real estate, and of that, a very small amount in office buildings. And who could have predicted COVID and the implication of office buildings? So we were very purposeful in how we positioned our company for that.
So flash forward to 2024. Let's talk more specific to Nashville and Tennessee. I can't imagine a more wonderful place to be the president of Fifth Third Bank than in Tennessee, considering the incredible growth and how hot it has been over the last 10 years versus maybe getting too hot, too warm. Is there a possibility, not just from a banking perspective, which is obviously your perspective, Dave, but just from a citywide perspective, is there an ability to go too hot, too fast, and how do we balance that with the growth that we do have?
I think it's a great question, Matt. As we've touched on earlier, I think there's the difference between the theoretical and the reality. So in theory, yeah, hey, I'd like it to be 72 people a day, and here's where the growth will, and here's a sequence of how it's going to all occur. But the reality is we don't have that luxury. And so I would much rather us be trying to strive to go from 88 people a day to 90 versus going to 86 and going, all right, that's okay. And then it goes to 84. And then before you know it, it's going the wrong direction. So I growth has its challenges and its dynamics, but I'd much rather be faced with those kind of challenges than the other. As we touched on, just how Nashville will look in the future, when you've seen how far it's come and how much the Broadway side of the city has blossomed, I don't think we've seen anything yet. I think the East Bank will be a whole other level of growth, starting obviously with this Titan Stadium, but what's going on with the Oracle campus, TPAC moving over there, and that's the tip of the iceberg. That will open up that whole area, which is going to be amazing.
The residual growth and the effort and planning being put into making sure that that happens structurally from an infrastructure standpoint the right way, and then allow business to to walk through the doors of Fifth Third and say, hey, let's talk about a construction loan. Let's talk about, to allow the private sector to come in and flush that out and kind of, put the feathers on the bird, as they say. It's an incredibly exciting time. And you're right. We have a very big vote coming up in the city of Nashville and in Davidson County with regard to transit. And, I'm in Wilson County. And so while I am a voice in the community and I like to speak to that, I feel like, well, ultimately Davidson County will make those decisions. At the same time, the alternative could be we need to figure out what to do about buildings that are no longer occupied. In some cities, that's the questions they're asking themselves. So if we're asking ourselves, how can we better get people from A to B to C in the city that we have, that's a good challenge to have.
I agree. And, I'll oftentimes hear, well, I'll never ride the bus. Sure. But the person that needs to go to get their education might have to. The person that needs to go get their job does. And how are they getting there now? They're in cars. So that's less transit for all of us. I think these smart signals that, again, how frustrating it is. You come up on a stoplight and you're looking, there's nobody coming the other way, but you wait. So just the technology that provides of quicker, cleaner elements at intersections, I think will be a game changer. And I think just to me, if you think traffic is great right now, then don't do anything. Don't vote for it. But if you think we can do better, what's the old quote, Einstein?
Definition of insanity.
Definition of insanity. You keep doing the same thing, expecting a different result. And I like how there's a clear path of funding this. So I think it's got a lot of positive elements to it. And I think it will be helpful.
Do you plan to retire here?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, our big variables are where our kids will ultimately settle and, hopefully
grandchildren, whatever down the road. Right.
And we're blessed, as I mentioned, we spend a fair amount of time at our lake house in Alabama, but I can't ever see not having a home base here in Nashville. It's just too vibrant. The friends, connections that we built now over a quarter of a century, which is hard to believe. You just can't replace that, Matt. So it's just a great place to continue to have roots.
Well, it's an absolute pleasure to get to know you, to get to meet you, to get to talk about Fifth Third and everything you bring to the community. Dave, thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Matt. Appreciate all that you do. Thank you for what you do in the community.
Thanks again to Dave Briggs of Fifth Third Bank. He's the regional vice president located right here in Nashville, Tennessee, for spending a few moments with us on Nashville Forward. I've been your host, Matt Murphy, and it's always a pleasure to connect with you, to talk business and the city of Nashville and the great state of Tennessee. Find Nashville Forward every place you get your podcast, including Apple and Spotify. We invite you to go over there and like us, subscribe, do what you need to do to give the thumbs up on Nashville Forward. And we will see you next time on Nashville Forward.